What if one of the most powerful wealth rituals in all of Jewish history required nothing more than a handful of salt, a table, and the understanding of why the sages considered this combination to be among the most sacred acts a family could perform inside their home? Not a ritual reserved for the wealthy, not a practice belonging only to scholars or rabbis. A ritual performed in the humblest homes across every century of Jewish life, in the stone houses of ancient Jerusalem, in the wooden dwellings of Eastern European shtetls, in the tenement apartments of immigrants who arrived with nothing, and observed, generation after generation, to carry within it a power that transformed the relationship between those who practiced it and the abundance they were seeking. Today, I am going to reveal what this ritual is, where it comes from, and why the ancient sages believed, and the Kabbalists confirmed in precise mystical language, that salt, properly understood and properly used, is not merely a seasoning, it is a covenant, and the home that honors this covenant lives under a different kind of blessing than the home that does not. Stay with me, because what I am about to share is not superstition dressed in ancient clothing. It is one of the most carefully reasoned teachings in all of Torah wisdom, and it may change the way you see your table, your salt, and your home forever. We begin not in a mystical academy. We begin in the book of Leviticus, in a verse that most readers pass over without stopping, because its meaning requires context that the plain text does not supply. The Torah issues an instruction that seems, on its surface, to be purely about temple ritual. Every offering brought to the altar of the tabernacle, every sacrifice, every grain offering, every sacred gift brought before God was required to be salted before it was offered. The Torah states explicitly, "You shall not allow the salt of the covenant of your God to be absent from your offerings. On every offering you shall offer salt. Salt of the covenant, not salt as flavoring, not salt as preservative, though it functioned as both. Salt as covenant, as the substance through which the relationship between the human being and the divine source of all provision was formalized, sealed, and renewed. The rabbis of the Talmud built on this foundation and made an observation that would shape Jewish practice in every home, in every century, from that moment to the present day. They taught, the table upon which we eat is the altar, and if the temple altar required salt before any offering could be valid, then the family table, the altar of the home, requires salt as well, not as mere condiment, as an act of sacred covenant, as the renewal with every meal of the relationship between the household and the divine source that provides it. The Talmud in Tractate Chagiga states plainly, when the temple stood, the altar brought atonement for Israel. Now that the temple is destroyed, a person's table brings atonement. Every family meal, understood in its fullness, is a sacred act. Every gathering around a table is a miniature temple service, and every placing of salt upon that table is the renewal of the same covenant that was renewed upon the altar of the ancient sanctuary. This is the origin of one of the most consistently observed practices in all of Jewish life, placing salt on the table before every meal and dipping bread into salt before eating, not as habit, not as tradition preserved by inertia, but as a deliberate, conscious covenant act, the sealing of the meal within the sacred relationship that governed the offerings of the ancient temple. But the teaching does not end there, because when the Kabbalists of Safed, and above all the school of Rabbi Yitzchak Luria, the Ari, the Lion, turned their extraordinary attention to this practice, they revealed layers within it that earlier teaching had only begun to suggest. It was a Friday afternoon in Saft, in the mid-16th century. The students of the Ari had gathered in the home of one of their circle, a man named Reb Shimon bar Levi, a silversmith by trade who had turned from commerce to Torah study in his later years and become one of the Ari's closest disciples. Reb Shimon's wife, a woman the tradition remembers only as Devorah, was preparing the Shabbat table. She laid the white cloth. She placed the 2 braided loaves of challah, covered with their embroidered cloth. She lit the candles as the sun began its descent toward the Galilean hills, and then she placed the small bowl of salt at the center of the table, as her mother had done, and her mother before her, back through generations she could not count. The Ari arrived with his students. Before he sat down, he paused at the doorway of the dining room. He looked at the table, at the salt bowl at its center, for a long moment. One of the younger students, a man named Reb Avraham, noticed the pause and asked quietly, "Rabbi, what do you see?" The Ari looked at him with those eyes his students described as simultaneously ancient and alert, the eyes of a man who saw the world at more than one depth at once. "I see the covenant of the home," the Ari said softly. "And I want to teach you something before we sit, because most people perform this practice without understanding what they are doing. And when you do not understand what you are doing, the practice is only half alive." He invited them all to remain standing for a moment, and there, at the threshold of the Shabbat table, by the light of the candles Devorah had just kindled, he taught them the full mystical structure of the salt covenant as he understood it. What he taught that evening was this: salt, in the Kabbalistic framework, is unlike any other substance on the table. It is neither plant nor animal. It is mineral, drawn from the sea or from the earth, but in either case, from a source that has no life cycle, no season of growth and season of decay. It does not rot, it does not age. It is, in the language of the mystics, a substance outside of time, and this quality, its timelessness, its incorruptibility, its capacity to preserve rather than to decay, made it, for the ancient world and for the Kabbalistic tradition, the physical embodiment of what the Hebrew word brit means: covenant, a binding that does not expire, a relationship that does not decay. When you place salt on your table and dip your bread into it before eating, you are not simply following a custom. You are enacting physically, bodily, in the most concrete possible way, the following declaration: this meal, this table, this home, and the abundance that fills it are held within a covenant. They are not the product of chance or luck or the impersonal machinery of an indifferent world. They are the provision of a source that has entered into relationship with this household. And this household, by this act of salting, acknowledges that relationship and commits to its obligations. What are those obligations? The Ari was precise. He named 3. The first obligation of the salt covenant is honor. The Hebrew word is kavod, the same word used for the honor due to parents, to teachers, to guests, and to the divine. In its root meaning, kavod means weight, significance. The practice of placing salt on the table with intention, rather than shaking it absently from a container without thought, is an act of kavod toward the meal, toward the food, toward the source from which it came. It is the act of saying with your hands and your presence, "I see this. I see what is on this table. I see the labor and the provision and the blessing that brought this food here, and I honor it." The Talmud teaches that a scholar who recites a blessing over food without full attention, without genuine acknowledgement of what he is receiving, has failed in something more significant than ritual. He has failed in basic honesty, the honesty of recognizing what he has been given. Kavod begins with honest seeing, and the salt, placed with intention, is the daily practice of honest seeing, the refusal to take for granted what has been provided. The second obligation is sharing. The covenant of salt in biblical law was always a covenant between parties, a binding that created mutual obligation in both directions. The salt covenant of the table, the Ari taught, creates between the household and its guests a bond of spiritual significance. This is why the tradition of welcoming guests, Hachnasat Orkim, is considered by the rabbis to be among the most important commandments governing the life of the home. The salt on the table is an implicit invitation. It says, "This is not merely our table, it is an altar, and altars are places of shared offering." The home that keeps its salt covenant, that honors guests and shares its table generously, honors the covenant in its fullness, and the covenant, when fully honored, returns blessing in kind. The third obligation is the one that surprised the Ari's students most, and the one least transmitted in popular understanding of the salt ritual. It is purity of speech at the table. The Ari taught that the family table, consecrated as an altar by the salt covenant, carries with it the same awareness about language that governed the temple. The temple was a place of purity, a space in which the ordinary human tendencies toward gossip, complaint, bitterness, and idle speech were understood to be incompatible with its sacred purpose. Similarly, the Ari taught, the family table should be a space in which the quality of speech is elevated. Not silence. The tradition loves conversation, story, and song at the Shabbat table, but an awareness of how words are used in the space the salt has consecrated. This teaching, when understood, explains something that many families have observed without being able to name. Meals eaten with genuine warmth and gratitude feel different from meals eaten with complaint and tension. The food seems to nourish differently. The atmosphere of the house afterward is different. Something changes in the quality of the shared experience. And according to the Ari's teaching, that change is not merely psychological. It reflects a real difference in the spiritual quality of what is happening at the table. The covenant is either being honored or it is being quietly violated, and the household feels the difference, even when no one can say why. The Ari then taught the specific form of the ritual as he understood it should be performed. This is the practice I want to give you today, not as a distant historical curiosity, but as a living, practical tool for your own home and table. Before each meal, and especially before the Shabbat meal, which the tradition considers the most powerful moment of the week for the renewal of household blessing, place a small dish of coarse salt on the table. Not poured and forgotten, placed with intention. As you place it, pause for one breath. In that breath, hold the awareness of what you are doing. You are renewing the covenant. You are saying with your hands, your body, your presence, that this table is an altar, that the food on it is provision, not accident, that the source of that provision is real, present, and in relationship with your household. Then, before you eat the first piece of bread, take a piece, dip it in the salt, and eat it. This act is called in Jewish law melishat halakem, the salting of the bread. It is the moment at which the covenant is formally renewed. The bread represents your effort, your labor, your active participation in the process of provision. The salt represents the divine dimension, the covenant that holds and blesses that effort. And the act of eating them together is the integration of both, the human and the divine, the effort and the grace, the work and the blessing, joined in the mouth and taken into the body. After the meal, before you clear the salt from the table, leave it for a moment. The tradition teaches that the blessing of the meal extends beyond the eating itself, and the salt, remaining on the table, holds the covenant open for that extended moment. Many Jewish families following this tradition do not immediately clear the salt when eating is done, but allow the table to remain set briefly, letting the blessing settle into the household before the meal is finally cleared. And one final teaching, which the Ari gave his students as they at last sat down at Reb Shimon's Shabbat table that evening. He said, "Look at the salt. Look at how it is composed of individual crystals, each one distinct, each one complete in itself, and yet together forming something greater than any single crystal could be alone. This," he said, "is the image of the household that lives in covenant. Each member, each person gathered at the table, distinct, individual, irreducible, and yet together in the binding of shared salt, forming something greater, a household, a covenant community, a vessel for blessing that none of them could constitute alone. This is why, he concluded, the salt is placed at the center of the table, not at the head, not at the edge, at the center, because the covenant does not belong to any one member of the household. It belongs to all of them equally. It is the ground they share. Now let us speak plainly of why this practice, understood in its fullness, carries the power that generations of Jewish families attributed to it. The Kabbalists taught, with precision and consistency across every school of thought, that the flow of abundance into a household is not determined primarily by the external conditions that household faces. It is determined by the spiritual quality of the household itself, by what the mystics called its kli, its vessel quality, the degree to which it is open, ordered, consecrated, and aligned with the principles through which blessing flows. The household that lives in covenant with its source of provision, that acknowledges and returns to that covenant daily through intentional, grateful acts, is a household whose vessel is kept clean and open. And a clean, open vessel receives more than one that is closed, cluttered, or indifferent to what it has already been given. The salt ritual, practiced with genuine intention and understanding, accomplishes several things simultaneously that shape this vessel quality in profound ways. It creates a daily moment of conscious recognition, the pause before the meal in which the household together acknowledges the source of its provision. This practice of acknowledgement, performed consistently over weeks and months and years, reshapes the household's fundamental orientation toward abundance, from taking for granted to grateful recognition, from the background anxiety of scarcity to the lived experience of covenant provision, from the sense that everything is contingent and fragile to the felt knowledge that the household is held. It creates a boundary of sacred speech around the table, a quality of language and relationship during the meal that builds over time a foundation of warmth and genuine connection. Households that share meals in that quality of warmth and attention build a relational strength that is among the most reliable foundations of lasting well-being in every dimension of life. And it connects the household, through this one simple, ancient act, to every Jewish home that has ever performed it, in every century, in every country, under every condition. There is something that cannot be fully analyzed, but can be deeply felt in the performance of a practice that links you backward through time to your ancestors and forward to the children who will perform it after you. It says, we belong to something larger than our present circumstances. We are part of a covenant that has outlasted every difficulty ever brought against it. Devorah, the wife of Reb Shimon, watched from the doorway as the Ari taught that Shabbat evening, and when the teaching was finished and the students sat down to the meal, she performed the ritual she had performed every week of her adult life. But now, she said afterward, she understood what she was doing. I thought I was seasoning bread, she told her daughter later. I did not know I was renewing a covenant, every week, every Shabbat, my mother before me and her mother before her, all of them renewing the same covenant at the same table, without perhaps knowing its full name, but the covenant was real whether they named it or not, and the blessing was real too. That is the teaching of the ancient salt ritual. It is not complicated. It requires no special implements, no rare ingredients, no particular expertise. It requires only coarse salt, a table, bread, and the intention to understand what you are doing and why. Place the salt. Pause for one breath. Dip the bread. Eat in awareness and gratitude. Protect the quality of speech at your table. Welcome those who come to share it, and leave the salt a moment longer than you think necessary, letting the blessing settle before the table is cleared. These are small acts. They take almost no time, but practiced faithfully With genuine understanding and intention, they transform the spiritual quality of the household in which they are performed. They make of the table what it was always meant to be, an altar, and of the home what it was always meant to be, a vessel for covenant blessing. Subscribe to this channel. Each week I bring you another piece of this living inheritance, the wisdom of Torah, the teachings of the Kabbalistic masters, the ancient practices that have sustained Jewish families across 20 centuries of difficulty into lives of meaning, wholeness, and enduring abundance. Share this teaching with someone whose table you have sat at, or whose table you would like to bless. Because covenant, when shared, grows stronger, and the blessing that flows from it grows wider. And in the comments below, tell me, do you already keep salt on your table? And did you know, before today, what that act was truly about? The covenant is older than any of us. It is renewed every time we sit down with awareness and gratitude. Shalom.